I've been asked to talk about self-help books. Now, the first thing this made me ask is whether self-help books are actually useful to people. Can they really improve your life? And following that, what do we even categorize as a self-help book? The term is pretty broad and can fit generic lifestyle advice, as well as more serious philosophy that received the label by the publisher to sell more copies. I've got to admit, looking back, I've become a bit skeptical about this whole genre. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the ideas can be pretty decent. Reading these books can make you feel energized and motivated to change your life, but when it comes down to it, I would argue they cause little change in the long run. At least that's the pattern I've been seeing in my life. But you can look around and see that change is really difficult, and straight up advice is almost never enough. In my observations, people only ever change if they have a reason at the fundamental level. Something about their worldview or values changes, or they have a strong emotional trigger that shocks them into change. Otherwise, you can throw advice at people and they're not going to care much. But do you know which books can impact worldviews, values, and emotions? Good novels and philosophy books. When I consider everything that I've ever read, what stands out the most are great stories and the books that introduced me to a new way to look at the world. While on the other hand, I can't remember much from books like How to Win Friends and Influence People or The War of Art, which were still some of the better self-help books that I've read. But since we're getting a bit tangled, it might be helpful to look at this problem in layers. The self-help genre tends to speak about habits, behavior, tips, and advice. Great novels speak to the emotions and the why behind your actions, while philosophy books impact your worldview, the core principles that you might not even be fully aware of, but on which you structure your life. And I believe that you can't really implement lasting change working on the level of behavior and advice. That's because you can only fight yourself for so long, and those deeper layers are always going to win in the end. So your internal reward system must lean towards the new behavior for you to stick with it. Without that part, you're simply going to revert back to what you're used to. There is a good reason why people often say that you can't outwork someone who's having fun. That's that internal reward system. And regarding that, just yesterday I've been talking to friends about the habit of going to the gym. And I've noticed that people often talk about discipline and forcing themselves to go, motivating themselves to go, and how difficult it is. But I'm well aware that I wouldn't be able to work out nearly as much if I had to force myself to do it. I'm able to do it because each round of training, each unit of effort gives me a bigger reward than the effort expended. It's not about some sort of far-off reward. I've made the behavior itself rewarding enough to the point where it doesn't require much effort. But it's a bit of a generic example, so let's go beyond that and talk about those books that receive the self-help tag, but go beyond your usual frameworks and advice. And after that, I'll go a bit more into novels and philosophy and what they have to do with everything. So, I've mentioned earlier how broad the term self-help can be. I don't imagine many authors are starting a book wondering which 3 categories on Amazon they want to put it in. As a result, you will end up having authors who share really original perspective on life or their profound knowledge in psychology and philosophy, but they will end up in the same category as 5 advice for a better life. I wouldn't be surprised if a book like that actually exists. But that's why I would like to give special consideration to titles like The Courage to be Disliked, which on some sites receives the tag of self-help, even though I would consider it closer to philosophy and ethics. But I know that the title itself can sound a bit like a self-help book. One interesting concept that the book has introduced is recognizing which tasks in life you're responsible and never stepping over the bounds of someone else's tasks. But the book itself has a ton of knowledge beyond that. I have yet to read it, so I'm not going to go into it, but I'll do a separate video about the subject sometime in the future. Alright, but if there are generic useless titles and some actually decent books that sometimes both land in the same category, then you might be wondering, how do you tell which one is worth reading? Personally, I would forget about books that talk about habits, methods, or frameworks. And instead, I would look into books that explore some sort of interesting concept or provide an intriguing statement that you feel drawn to understand more. At the end of the day, consider the book for what it is and don't judge it based on the tag that it had landed under or where it placed on the bestseller list. I myself tend to end up choosing books that lean quite a bit more into the philosophy side of things, or preferably great novels that connect both philosophy and a great narrative. That's the peak of literature for me. But I can't tell if they're the most helpful in general or if they just speak to me the most. That part is something you will have to test for yourself. After all, I can only speak for myself. but I do strongly believe that at least understanding is much better than advice. Either way, the most impactful texts in my life can be split into two categories. And yes, this is where we get back to novels and philosophy. Something that only came to mind when I was preparing for this video is how much novels and great stories shaped my worldview and values. Seeing decisions and their consequences from all kinds of perspectives playing out in emotionally heavy narratives surely influenced my decisions in real life. When a good story tries to get a message across, whether that's about consequences of a certain choice or certain actions, or about moral virtues that we should follow, it gets interpreted closer to a lived experience, to a real story, instead of distilled advice which rarely provides any context or convincing reason for why we should listen to it. And even stories that are simply trying to be entertaining and they're not trying to make any sort of grand point will end up impacting you through their characters' struggles and how they overcome them. You can see that there are tons of people who in some way admire or look up to fictional characters. So definitely give novels a try. I believe that fiction is heavily underrated, but non-fiction can also teach us a lot. For example, I'm still rereading the Tao Te Ching and trying to adapt it more to my life. The reason why I enjoy philosophy books is because whenever they share any kind of advice on how to act, they do so with the underlying principles of why that is the correct way to act. They help you understand the topic, give suggestions on how it can be approached, and provide extensive argumentation for a proposed solution, as well as a decent critique on alternatives. Now, if you're looking for some recommendations, I've recently finished something that you could consider a third option, blending philosophy and storytelling, which, in my opinion, keeps a lot of the advice, but makes it more memorable through a narrative. And what I'm talking about right now is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. It's the most recent book that I finished. It was a really nice short read. The small book like that even fits in my pocket. But I still think back to many ideas that the book has shared, and because it was through a narrative, I can remember it much easier and actually consider them in a given context. Even the book itself shares that wisdom cannot be imparted or taught, so not every kind of information can be given, which is yet another reason why I believe in narratives so much, because they can go beyond the pure information, beyond the sharing of knowledge, and they can sort of give you a context that isn't expressible through distilled information. If you've read it, then let me know your thoughts, and if you maybe want to read along with me, then follow the channel. I'm currently finishing up the Count of Monte Cristo, and next up I'll probably focus on The Courage to be Disliked and Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm looking that way because this is where the bookshelf is. See you next time.